A few years ago, I was traveling to a speaking engagement in Canada. Now, I normally go through the Windsor Tunnel or the Ambassador Bridge, but this particular engagement was in a town called Wallaceburg. So I went across a car ferry, actually, across part of the Detroit River. Now, I'm from the Great Lakes state, and a lot of the car ferries here can hold a massive amount of cars, so the boats themselves are pretty big. This was not one of those car ferries, though. It held 2 cars total. So I got on the car ferry, and the guy who was running the car ferry said, you know what, just stay in your car. It's going to be a short trip. This was one of those rickety sort of small car ferries. I was waiting for the guy to pull me across the river, sort of Lord of the Rings style and these old kind of things. Well, I stayed in this car ferry, and I'm terrible with directions. So right when the car ferry left the dock, I happened to look down at my GPS, making sure that my destination was correct on my GPS. But because I stayed in the car, I couldn't feel us leave the dock. But because I was looking down at my GPS, I didn't see us leave the dock. So I had that sort of strange sense that we've all had, we're sitting at an intersection and there's a bus next to us and the bus moves forward and we're not quite sure if we're moving backwards or the bus is moving forward, that strange vertigo and that strange panic. Well, I had that because I couldn't sense movement, but I could sense somehow that we were in fact moving. So my vertigo wasn't going away, because when you're sitting at a streetlight, you can look around and you can see a building or something that's fixed, a fixed position that allows you to get your bearings. That's when all the vertigo and all the confusion goes away. Well, I was on a river, so none of the confusion could go away because the river is constantly moving, and the boat would be moving, and I would be moving. So I had no fixed points of reference with which to sort of clear up the confusion. I think culture today, in a post-truth culture, we're a lot like that. I want you to think about the questions we ask ourselves now. Questions we never would have fathomed before. Questions like, what does it mean to be human? We're actually asking ourselves, can we augment human reality, like our minds and our bodies, in a way to become post-human? Or what does it mean to be male? Or what does it mean to be female? What does sex mean anymore? Is marriage a real institution? These are questions that were once considered givens when it came to the answers. But now, for some reason, they're all up for grabs. We're in the river, as it were. We left dry land so long ago that we left any fixed points of reference. In fact, I would say that we left dry land so long ago that we've actually forgotten what it means to have stability. We sort of like being confused. We like being in the constantly flowing river. It reminds me of something that happened in the 1980s, and I'm a child of the 80s, and there was this phenomenon. It was called Cold War psychosis, where children would wake up in the middle of the night screaming, having nightmares, thinking that the United States and the USSR had finally engaged in a Cold War and pushed the buttons that made the Cold War suddenly very hot. Now, amidst all of that, there were these voices that were rising saying, I know there's confusion out there, but follow me and I'll be the sort of man of steel or woman of steel who will lead you out of these kind of things. Reminds me of the quote from a song that was popular in the 1980s, called Land of Confusion by the band Genesis. The words were these: oh, Superman, where are you now? When everything's gone wrong somehow, these men of steel, these men of power, are losing control by the hour. When you think of all the confusion that's happening in our day, whether it's social or political or sexual or whatever it might be, we're in the land of confusion. That song, written in the 80s, could have been written today. And the men of steel and the women of steel are trying to rise up and say, follow me. But we're awash in this sea of confusion. We don't know who to follow or what the truth actually is. That's why in 2016, at the end of 2016, Oxford English Dictionaries named its word of the year as post-truth. Now, every year, Oxford English Dictionaries names its word of the year. And in 2016, in light of the US elections and all the things that were happening and the differences of opinions that were flying about, they said post-truth was the word of the year. Now, that word wasn't actually coined in 2016. Actually, it was coined much earlier, in 1992. But I think in 2016, it was used 2,000 times more often than in all the previous years combined. Now, what is a post-truth culture? A post-truth culture, according to Oxford English Dictionaries, is one that elevates feelings and preferences above facts and truth. It elevates feelings and preferences over facts and truth. Now, there are 2 kinds of a post-truth mentality. One is called the soft mode of post-truthism, which basically says this: we acknowledge that truth exists, but we don't care. The hard mode of it is that we can say truth exists, but I'm willingly going to lie in order to get my point across to serve a higher agenda. Now, this is a little different than the postmodern culture. Now, we've sort of seen a postmodern culture. It started in the 60s, got more steam in the 70s, got even more steam in the 80s, and was blossoming, so to speak, in the 90s, but has begun to sort of die its own death. Now, a postmodern culture says this: there are no objective truths. What's true for you is true for you, and what's true for me is true for me. But don't try to foist your opinion on me. Don't try to foist your truth on me, because if you say there's an objective truth and you try to foist that on me, well, that's a power move. So you see, a postmodern society says there are no objective truths. A post-truth culture is different. It says there are objective truths, but I don't care. I'll either lie about them to serve my agenda, or I'll subvert them to my preferences. That's a very different thing. You see, if you have a postmodern culture that says there are no objective truths, you can reason with somebody like that. Believe it or not, you can do it. So if they say there are no objective truths, the response back to that is simply this: is that statement that there are no objective truths, is that objectively true? And you can begin to see the self-defeating nature of the very mindset itself. And so people, when they see this, begin to come out of a postmodern mindset. But a post-truth culture is very different. A post-truth culture actually says there are objective truths, but I don't care. It's difficult then to actually reason with somebody like that, because if you show them the truth, they're going to subordinate it to their preferences and their feelings, or to their agenda. Whether there's someone who subscribes to the soft version that says truth exists, but I don't care, my preferences matter more, or there's somebody who subscribes to the hard version of post-truth that says there are truths, but I'm going to lie about them. It's a very difficult thing to reason with someone like that. But all of us, no matter what our walk of life, are susceptible to the post-truth mindset. There are those who think that, scientists, for example, shouldn't be subject to the post-truth mindset. Science, after all, is the objective, unbiased pursuit of truth. Kathleen Higgins, in her article, Post-Truth, A Guide for the Perplexed, talks about how disheartening a post-truth culture is. And she assumes that scientists would be immune from all of these influences because scientists are the unbiased, objective observers of truth. But in an article published in January of 2016, Adam Hoffman reported that fewer than half of the findings of scientific studies that were published in peer-reviewed academic journals actually could be reproduced. Now, this is important because reproducibility is an important part of the whole scientific endeavor. In other words, if you have a set of experiments or protocols in a scientific pursuit, you have to be able to reproduce those things so you can find out if your findings were more than a fluke and if they're actually reliable. But Adam Hoffman pointed out that in a study done of other studies that were published and peer-reviewed, less than half of them in certain fields could actually be reproduced. That suggests a couple of things. Either the scientists were sloppy, or they had a bias or a reason to actually either fudge the data or be sloppy in their protocols. Here's the point. No one is immune from the post-truth culture. If our preferences are to be published, or our preferences are to have a certain scientific agenda even forwarded, just because we don a lab coat doesn't mean that we're no longer human. It doesn't mean that we're suddenly Mr. Spock. We all have to realize that a post-truth culture that subverts facts and truth to preferences and feelings and agendas can infect all of us. Let's take it out of the scientific realm and put it into the everyday realm. I remember a number of years ago, I was speaking at a family camp, and there was this young man, a bright young man, who came up to me and had some very serious objections to the Christian faith. Now, before I spoke to him, his parents had come and talked to me, and they said, our son is here, and he was raised as a Christian, but he's got some really serious questions, and he claims to be an atheist now. And we can't answer his questions. In fact, we don't even let him ask questions anymore because we just don't have answers, and we're raised in a home where Christianity is true, we believe it, and that's all there is to it. So I said, I'd love to meet with your son and talk with him about his objections and see what they are. Well, we got together, and we spent some time after one of my speaking engagements sitting in the empty auditorium. And I said, so what are your toughest objections to Christianity? What's the problem? And he gave me some of them, and I was beginning to answer him. But as I answered him, I said, let me ask you a question. Have you looked for answers in certain places? What have you read that actually shows you both sides of the argument, both the atheistic side and the Christian side? And he said he hadn't read anything. Where he got his information was from Comedy Central and YouTube videos and Reddit online. You see, he hadn't actually done any scholarly interviews or scholarly review of the material. He'd actually wanted to find how Christianity is false, and as the saying goes, you find what you're looking for. He hadn't given both a fair chance because he wanted Christianity to be false. He had the preference for Christianity to be false, and he subverted all the other facts that could have proven Christianity true to his preferences. Well, I'll tell you this. During the course of our conversation, as I began to encourage his inquisitive, bright mind to look at all sides of it, I began to see that he actually was interested in finding out what the truth was. And I told him that his preferences to reject Christianity might be a biasing motivation against Christianity itself. We had an excellent conversation after that. Now, this might seem like a new thing, when we see the ideas that are cropping up right now, questions about sexual autonomy and gender autonomy. Is religion bunk? Politically speaking, what are the issues that we can actually talk about and subvert truth to our own agendas? And this might seem like a new phenomenon, and in some ways it is. But I'll tell you this, I think the seeds of the post-truth mindset actually were planted in the earliest garden, in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. Recall the story. Adam and Eve are created by God, and they're there in the Garden of Eden. And God tells them they can have the run of the whole place. They are to work the garden, this wonderful place where they can have anything they wanted. They were only given one command, and it was this: of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. Now that's the one command. And the reason why they're given that command is because God had wanted to instill the idea of relationship with them. The Bible says God walked and talked with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day. That's an amazing statement all by itself because it shows that intimacy, the purpose of humanity was relationship. And who knows how long Adam and Eve obeyed that command. They never even came close to wanting to imbibe of the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They were content with what God had given them and the relationship they had. But then along comes Satan, the Bible tells us. And he tells Eve first, and of course through her also Adam. And he says, did God really say? And then he misquotes God. He misquotes the command about eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And he says, God knows that you won't die when you eat of that fruit. God knows that when you eat of the fruit, you will become like God. Here's where the post-truth mindset set in. Eve and Adam walked and talked with the very truth incarnate in the cool of the day in the garden. And they knew the truth was that their relationship was to be with God. But Satan comes along and misquotes God. And Eve, because her preferences actually are more important to her than the truth, she misquotes God back to Satan. And now Satan knows he's got her. He knows he's got her, and he knows he'll have Adam as well through the same kind of trickery. The fruit that never tempted Eve before suddenly became tempting because her preference wasn't to be with God, which was the truth of her relationship with God. Her preference was to be God. And Adam had the same exact preferences. That's why the Bible says suddenly the fruit became pleasing to the eye and desirous for eating. Those were the seeds of the post-truth mindset. Now fast forward to Jesus and Pilate. The trial of all trials, where Jesus is standing before Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea. And Jesus is being accused of a lot of things. And Pontius Pilate asks him the question in John chapter 18, verses 37 and following. He says, are you a king? And Jesus responds and says, you are right that I'm in saying that I am a king. For this cause I have come into the world. He says, he's there to testify to the truth. And Jesus says this wonderful statement, everyone who is on the side of truth listens to me. One translation says, everyone who's on the side of truth hears my voice. Now, at this particular time, Pontius Pilate has the opportunity to ask Jesus, the very truth incarnate, the single most important question you could ask somebody who says, if you're on the side of truth, you'll hear my voice. He could have asked the single most important question. And in fact, he did ask it, but he asked it with a post-truth tone. He asked the question, what is truth? Now, there's two ways to ask that question. You can ask Jesus, what is truth? Wanting to know what the answer is. Or you could ask it the way Pilate asked it. You can say, what is truth? In a cynical way, and then walk out of the room. See, Pilate didn't want truth. His preferences mattered more to him, and political expediency and to wash his hands of the political mess he was in mattered more than actually listening to Jesus, who claimed to be the truth. You see, a post-truth mindset has resulted in cynicism, not skepticism. Skepticism is different. A skeptic is somebody who doesn't believe something until there's enough evidence for it. So the truth actually matters to a true skeptic. A cynic is different, where a skeptic doesn't believe something until there's enough evidence for it. A cynic is somebody who doesn't believe even when there is. And Pontius Pilate was a cynic because he had a post-truth mindset. His preferences and feelings mattered more than the truth. So that we see the seed of the post-truth mindset planted in the garden. We see its sapling sort of grow all through the history of humanity and begin to branch out in Pontius Pilate's days. But we're seeing it now, fully blooming in our post-truth society now. What's resulted now is that as we subordinate truth to our preferences and our feelings, confusion has become a virtue and clarity has become a sin. Think about this. When you look everywhere and you see sexual issues of sexual identity, sexual expression, and all these things, if you're confused about these things, you're a hero. If you're confused about social mores and sort of moral standards, and there are no objective moral standards, if you're confused about that, then you are somehow progressive. If you believe that morals can change over time. If you think that there are multiple paths to God, for example, and everyone's got part of the truth, but we're not totally sure, we're confused as to who has the actual truth, if anyone does, that's considered tolerant. So sexually confused, you're a hero. Morally confused, you're progressive. And religiously confused, you're tolerant. Conversely, if you're clear on sort of the boundaries of sexual mores, if you're clear on gender roles and gender identity, that's considered bigoted. If you're clear that there are certain moral standards and there are certain objective moral truths, well, that's considered regressive. And if you're clear that there's only one path to God and it's verifiably true, that's considered intolerant. So we see that confusion becomes a virtue and clarity becomes a sin. In the coming time together, we're going to see that this post-truth mindset has infected virtually every area of life. When it comes to freedom, what true freedom means, we'll see that a post-truth mindset has changed what we think of actual freedom. When it comes to what it means to be human and the idea of human dignity, a post-truth mindset has clouded that. When it comes to sexuality and gender identity, a post-truth mindset has elevated preferences over the facts and the science of the matter. When it looks at questions of faith and science, a post-truth mindset says that faith is antithetical to science, that there's a conflict, but the clarity is that it's not in conflict. And religious pluralism, do all roads actually lead to God? These are the questions we're going to be talking about in the coming sessions. Now, there's a post-truth confusion that's happened, but what I want to show you is that there's actually clarity that we can provide in regard to all of these issues. It was Jesus himself who said that he was the way, the truth, and the life. But that's quite an audacious claim to make. And you have to back that kind of thing up. I think that Jesus did back it up, historically speaking, I think philosophically speaking, and even existentially speaking in the ways that speak to our minds and our heart. We left dry land and now we're awash in the river, but there is dry land out there. There is a fixed point of reference that we can actually come to. Jesus claims to be the rock of our salvation, the one who is the unchanging dry land, the foundation on which we can rest.